If the rule of thumb in a capitalist economy is that more competition equals better prices, service, and choice, the merger announced last week between Rogers and Shaw raises plenty of questions. It's not yet a done deal, but such consolidation, particularly in the technology sectors, raises some bigger questions. With us now for a closer look, we welcome, in Edmonton, Alberta, Robin Shaban, principal economist and co-founder of the economic consulting firm Vivek Research. In the byward market of the nation's capital, Murad Hemmadi, the Logic's Ottawa correspondent covering business and innovation policy. And in midtown of the provincial capital, Subrata Bhattacharjee, national co-chair of the Competition and Foreign Investment Review Group at the law firm Borden Ladner Gervais. And it's great to welcome you three onto TVO tonight for this conversation about a deal that, pretty presumably is going to affect darn near everybody in this country, or certainly a huge chunk of people in this country. So, Robin, get us started. When you heard about the plans for the merger, I want to get everybody's first impression about what they thought. What was yours, Robin?
Well, my first instinct was to just gather as many facts as I could about it, because I wanted to think through how this could play out. And something that really struck me with this deal was in the press release that Rogers and Shaw put out, they really emphasized the billion-dollar efficiencies that this merger is going to create for them, which I think poses a significant wrinkle for the Competition Bureau if it plans to take any action against this merger and attempt to protect competition in the market.
Okay, more on that billion-dollar wrinkle as we continue our conversation. Murad, what were you thinking?
Well, I think, it's a massive deal, but not necessarily a huge surprise, given the links between these two companies historically, the way that they've acted in the past to sort of designate areas of the country where they operate. I was also struck by the fact that it seems like from the get-go, they've been sort of selling this deal to policymakers and regulators. A lot of the language and a lot of the promises in the deal seem pretty squarely aimed at, people making decisions in Ottawa rather than sort of the end user.
Okay, Subrata, what was your first thought?
So I had two thoughts. I mean, the first is, broadly speaking, what does this mean for this government and the previous government's sort of attempt to maintain the fourth carrier, which has been so important? And then the second part was, the Competition Bureau actually has expressed views on the structure of especially wireless in the economy. And so those aren't really much of a surprise to anybody. And so you'd think that the merging parties will have some dancing to do, and we'll see how that works out.
Murad, let's really try to understand what this deal is about, because, of course, for those of us who live in central Canada, Rogers means telecom, yes, but it also means sports stadiums. It also means, baseball teams. It also means television. It also means radio stations and televisions. It means a lot of things. So what is this deal largely about?
I'd say it's about cable, and when we say cable, we mean both TV, the sort of the box that gives you your TV, and then your internet connection. And the way that the country is split up, Rogers is very strong in the East on TV and internet, and then Shaw is very strong in the West on TV and internet. And that's actually by design. In 1994, these two companies made a deal over the assets of a company called McLean Hunter, which that first name should be familiar to you. It's also how Rogers bought McLean's a long time ago. They sort of split the country up on cable grounds. It's also about wireless. So, Rogers has the Rogers wireless brand, cell phones, your cell phone plan, as well as other brands that it operates like Fido. And then Shaw has what's now called Freedom, which used to be Wind Mobile, which is that fourth carrier that was just referenced. In parts of the country, in Alberta and Ontario and in BC, where they offer wireless plans, generally speaking at a lower rate than a Rogers or a Bell or a TELUS. So it's about pulling all of those assets into one place. It's also about Shaw needing to spend a lot of money to build out, 5G. You hear a lot about 5G. That's the sort of next generation of wireless networks. It's about Shaw needing billions of dollars to build out the infrastructure to be able to deliver 5G, and the idea that this combined company will have more resources to be able to do that.
Boy, there's an expression in sports, you can't tell the players without a program. I think they should use that expression in this situation as well, because there are a lot of players involved here, or certainly there have been in the past. Subrata, I guess what we need to find out at this point is it's not a done deal, as we suggested in the intro. It still needs the approval of the broadcast regulator. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine this not going through?
Well, I mean, I think even the parties know that they're going to have a pretty frank discussion with the Competition Bureau about wireless. And that's not a surprise to anybody. I think they built in timing. I think the deal's scheduled to close in 2022. So they're clearly building in like a significant review period for the three different sort of government reviews that have to happen, because it's not just the Competition Bureau, but also the federal government, because the minister will talk about the transfer of the spectrum on the wireless side, and the CRTC will have to sort of approve the transfer of licenses. So they know they've got three different approval processes to manage, and that's just going to take time. At the end result, maybe the deal goes through, but the real question is, does it go through in substantially the same form as it's been proposed? Probably some parts of the business will have to be up for sale or some sort of auction process is what I would guess.
Can you give us a for instance on that? And I'm thinking, I remember when Rogers did some consolidation in its television packages, they had to get rid of some stations, they had to pick up some other stations and so on. What can you see happening here?
Well, I mean, there's a bit of a precedent with what the Bureau did in the Bell MTS deal in 2017, where you also had sort of a national entity acquiring more regional sort of operator. And then what the Competition Bureau tried to do there was to basically arrive at a remedy that sort of supported the fourth carrier strategy. And so they required the merging parties to sort of sell some stuff to TELUS and then sell other stuff, including spectrum, to ExploreNet, which was really more of a regional internet company. And then the idea there was that would sort of increase competition as ExploreNet would be allowed to sort of do its thing. And then, of course, TELUS would become more vigorous. Now, I think the jury's still out on how that worked, but that is the kind of approach that you could see sort of applied here. Again, assuming that things like, the efficiencies defense and stuff that Robin may have a view on will not otherwise save the deal. So I'm not sure that's likely.
Yeah, Robin, let me circle back with you now and talk about that billion-dollar wrinkle that you referenced in your first answer. Just explain to us what that means and the significance of it. Sure.
So something that is unique to Canada's competition law, which is the Competition Act, is that we have a little segment in there that's commonly known as the efficiencies defense. There are very few countries in the world that have anything like this. And essentially what this efficiencies defense allows is it allows for mergers that are very likely going to hurt competition and hurt consumers if the efficiencies from the transaction are sufficiently large. And to illustrate, I think the best way to do that is to give an example. So the most infamous case of the efficiencies defense in practice was in the mid-90s, where Superior Propane purchased ICG Propane, both of which engaged in the distribution and sale of propane. So when Superior purchased ICG, it was estimated that this would increase the price of propane by about 8%. Despite these price increases, or estimated price increases, the deal was still allowed to go through because the deal was estimated to create about $20 million in cost savings every year. And keep in mind, too, some of those cost savings are job losses. As a result of the merger, we now have a monopoly, like full-blown monopoly, in the sale of propane in 16 communities across Canada. And Superior Propane has a market share of 80% or more in about 30 other communities. So if this efficiencies defense is evoked in this case, and at the end of the day, we won't really know until the Competition Bureau does its analysis. But if it is evoked, it's very possible that this Rogers and Shaw deal will be able to go through without many concessions on their part to preserve competition, which I think could be potentially dangerous for mobile prices in particular in the country.
And Robin, let me assume that even though the estimates were prices would go up in propane by 8%, I'm guessing they went up more. Is that right?
Well, as far as I know, there's never been a retrospective analysis of this, but I mean, stay tuned. I'm working on one. I think this is something that our competition authority in this country could be doing more of. We see this sort of analysis done in the US by the Federal Trade Commission. They're pretty good about looking back at decisions they've made and seeing if they were right. And I'd like to see more of that from the Competition Bureau.
Well, in which case, Robin, let me do one more with you here, which is, I think you've essentially answered what you've anticipated my next question to be, and that is, there's no way that efficiencies of scale are going to result in lower prices for consumers. Fair to say?
Very fair to say.
Okay, so the Liberals running in the last election on the notion of lowering cell phone bills by 25%, if this deal goes through, that promise is basically impossible to keep. Also fair to say?
Yeah, and the reason why it's going to be so hard to keep prices low after this transaction goes through, if it does, is that we're losing that regional competitor, which is Shaw. And the Competition Bureau, in its analysis of the Bell MTS merger, said point blank that when we lose one of the competitors in a market and we're stuck with the three big telcos, prices go up. And they demonstrated this with the company's own internal pricing data. They got access to this data, did their own analysis, and showed empirically that this is the case. And part of the driver of that is implicit collusive behavior between the telcos. So when you have fewer competitors in the market, the telcos can more easily work together cooperatively in order to keep prices high, which I think is a huge driver of the very high mobile prices that Canadians pay. And it's a challenge for policymakers who are looking to keep prices low.
And we should say here, you used to work for the Competition Bureau, so you're not just pulling this out of your backpack here. You have some understanding of how they think. Fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay, good. Subrata, let me get you on this. The notion that, yes, there may be efficiencies of scale and volume in these two big companies coming together, but the likelihood of consumers seeing a break as a result, probably not there?
Well, I think I'd step back a bit. The one thing about efficiencies is you've got to actually show that they are tied to the transaction. So it's not totally a given that defense would be applicable here. No question the parties are going to make those arguments. But, if you look at the Bell deal, the Bureau didn't accept the efficiencies arguments that the parties made there. So I don't know if we're quite there yet, including on how the efficiencies defense is going to work. But I will say the one thing I do agree with is that the Bureau's thinking about the importance of the fourth carrier and what the current sort of implications for pricing are on the wireless side out of the three incumbents, like that has not changed as recently as early of last year, because the Bureau sort of went on record before the CRTC basically setting out its view of the world. And so that's why I said at the beginning of my remarks, like, I don't think there's a lot of surprise what the Bureau is going to think. And the parties are going to really have to do a bit of dancing with the Bureau over the next year or so.
Murad, can I get you on that as well?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting, this question of the fourth carrier. I think the distinct fourth carrier was a little bit more of the last Conservatives government explicit policy. There were these stories about them trying to bring Verizon up here, the big U.S. carrier, to try and create that fourth. What the Liberal government has sort of taken this position that they want a specific set of plans, so plans between 2 and 6 gigs of data, to go down by 25%. That's what their 25% promise was ultimately about. But their proposed sort of, and they've said they want the companies to do this voluntarily. Their proposed remedy, if that doesn't work, is something called mobile virtual network operators, or MVNOs, which are very basically, wireless providers, service providers that don't necessarily own their own infrastructure, so antennas and spectrum and so on, but basically buy access. In fact, the Competition Bureau has sort of recommended one of these models in those CRTC proceedings that Subrata was talking about just now. those could be an alternative. And if the government's position has been, we're not doing it yet, and there's a CRTC proceeding ongoing, but if you don't drop prices, we're going to do this, and it's going to make it it's going to create more competition in the market. So it may not be a fourth carrier. It may be a sort of profusion of smaller carriers. The other thing is, if there is a requirement in this deal to sell off bits of that wireless infrastructure, Videotron, which operates in Quebec and is owned by Quebecor, has long been rumored to be looking outside Quebec for new markets. And they are a strong fourth carrier in Quebec and might present that opportunity outside the province.
If they were to pursue that, can you imagine them doing that through acquisition or new development or what?
Well, so the one idea that has been sort of mooted in the last week or so since this deal was announced, the Rogers Shaw deal was announced, was if parts of Freedom have to be sold off, then Videotron is sort of a natural acquirer.
Gotcha.
Outside of Quebec.
Let's, Robin, I do want to take advantage of the fact that you used to work for the Competition Bureau, and I want to get your sense of either how robust or not its efforts are in this country on behalf of consumers. What's the verdict on that?
Well, I think that officers at the Competition Bureau and the commissioner of the Competition Bureau, every day put in their best effort to try and protect and preserve competition in the country. I think a huge barrier that they face is our legislation. I think the efficiencies defense is just one example of how the Competition Bureau lacks the legislative tools it needs in order to protect competition. And I think we're increasingly out of step with competition legislations in other countries. I mean, back to the efficiencies defense to kind of harp on this. In another case of Superior Propane, sometime in 2013, Superior Propane attempted to acquire another company that dealt with industrial chemicals. The deal was approved in Canada, but it was also reviewable in the United States. And when it was reviewed by the Federal Trade Commission in the US, it was challenged. And that just demonstrates how our law compares to the United States and how in a lot of ways it's stronger than what we have here. And that's actually not saying a whole lot, because there is increasingly awareness by economic scholars in the US that their competition approach is actually not as strong as it needs to be in order to promote competition. And the Washington Center for Equitable Growth has recently put together a database of about 150 economics papers. And a lot of these papers show empirical evidence that the lax competition enforcement approach of authorities in the US has led to higher prices and less competition. One paper that I find very compelling is a 2016 study that looks at mergers and acquisitions in the manufacturing sector. And the study shows that, in fact, most mergers lead to higher prices, which is kind of mind-boggling if you think that America has a system for preventing mergers that increase prices. And if we know that Canada's system, especially when it comes to mergers, is more lax than America's, then, I mean, for sure we have a problem. So I think, the core issue here is Canada's legislation and the need to modernize it, especially in this new digital era where competition issues are becoming more and more complex.
Well, just for argument's sake, let me throw the other side of the coin out there, and Subrata, I'll get you to comment on it, and you tell me if this has any currency at all. I can see companies coming forward and saying, yes, we understand, government, why you think it would be better for consumers to have more smaller players in this country, but we actually think that if you want us to compete internationally on a global scale, it makes more sense to have fewer bigger players, because otherwise, how do we compete with others in this space who are 3, 5, 10 times bigger than us? Does that argument have any weight in this?
So, from time to time, this idea of applying competition law in such a way that you create national champions or support sort of the ability to do stuff outside of Canada has been raised to try to save certain deals or justify certain kinds of conduct. The reality is that competition law, at least the traditional view, which frankly is under scrutiny, discussion in a bunch of jurisdictions. So, Robin's point in that is an interesting one. But traditionally, it's been seen to look at efficiency, overall efficiency of the economy. And so as a result, those types of considerations may be important to governments to look at, but maybe not using competition law as a tool to do that. And that's part of I think the challenge that we face is that we now do have a recognition that markets can do a lot of things. We also have, I think, a recognition in some concern that markets are also not doing a lot of things. And there may be good things for governments to do to address that. The only issue is whether competition law in Canada, for example, as drafted, as the legislature chose to do this, previously, is the right tool. And the only other thing I would say is it is probably a good thing for us to be reviewing the state of our legislation every couple of years anyway, to make sure that it reflects the current environment that we're all in. The last time we did this in Canada was in 2009, but probably it is about time for us just to sort of do a bit of a checkup to see how we're doing. And I think you will see that there are even efforts to suggest that even now. So.
2009 is not all that long ago, but I guess in the digital technological world, I mean, that's the last century or even further back?
I think there are certainly things that we have seen in other jurisdictions that should make us at least try to address how we're doing in Canada. There may be very good reasons for us to maintain the structure of our act in certain ways that are different from laws in the US, in the EU, or in Australia, for example. But certainly there's no harm in sort of looking at that and just doing a bit of a health check.
Okay, since you've brought the other jurisdictions around the world in, let's broaden our discussion. And I do want to take a look south of the border because, they frame discussions in the United States like this as matters of antitrust. And, the United States, we're told, has so much better and more aggressive antitrust measures than we do here in Canada. But if that's the case, and Murad, why don't you get us started on that? If that's the case, why have they essentially allowed some tech giants to basically, they're in charge. They're running everything now. How has that been allowed to happen?
Yeah, they've sort of gained this big tech moniker that sort of describes their position. It's a bunch of different factors. One of which is, and Robin was alluding to this earlier on, the sort of focus of competition law. I think, but basically. The way that these services, think about a Google or a Facebook, you use those services for free kind of upfront. You're not paying for search or paying to use the social network. There's not really a pricing angle to it, right? Consumers aren't paying higher rates because these companies are getting bigger. Now, there's these big questions about, in 2021, does market power come from your ability to set prices, or does it come from the amount of data you have about the people that use your services? Does it come from there's this classic idea in tech of the network effect. The more people that are on your platform, the more useful that platform becomes. So the more people use a social network, the more other people want to be on there. The more you use a search engine, the better that search engine gets.
But that's how we pay.
And it reinforces it. Exactly, right? But that reinforces itself. So it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and better and better and better. So in theory, the consumer is actually getting a better service as these companies get bigger, because there are more people you can be friends with on Facebook, or more, better search results. All of these things. But that's not really how, as I understand it, competition law is set up to sort of deal with those issues. And now we are seeing, the Justice Department filed a major case against Google. I want to say like late last year, but I've lost all track of time around search. And, we're seeing these sort of second order effects, things like, does Google pay web browsers to use it as its default search engine? Does it pay device makers to make it the default? These are the questions we're now grappling with or at least they're grappling with in the US in competition law. We're not quite at that point yet in Canada.
No, Robin, let me bring you in on this too, because I think we're all accustomed to seeing the kind of dog and pony show that the American Congress does from time to time. They'll bring, the big tech guys up in front of Congress, and they'll put them through their paces, and they'll shake their fists, and they'll make a good show for the cameras, and then everybody goes home and they'll take their campaign contributions the next day. How seriously should we take the kind of scrutiny that American political authorities think they're putting big tech through these days?
Well, on the political side, I don't know. But I think on the antitrust side, so I'm talking about the actual attorneys and investigators that are digging into these issues and taking these companies to court, I think we should be taking it seriously. I think that these cases, I'm assuming, are coming from these large-scale investigations, these market studies that both the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice have undertaken over the last year and a half. And these sorts of studies are really special because it's actually not something that we can do in Canada. When American authorities do these large-scale market studies, they can reach out to companies and take internal information from them and use this information to not only understand trends in the industry, but also identify potentially anti-competitive behavior. And so the cases that we're seeing now, I don't think it's a coincidence, have followed from some of these large-scale market studies that these agencies have done. And like I mentioned before, the Canadian Competition Bureau doesn't have the power to do this. And I think that's part of the reason why Canada is a bit of a second mover when it comes to taking enforcement action against big tech. You see that with the 2016 investigation, the Bureau's 2016 investigation into Google. It followed the investigation that happened in the US, and some of the remedies that the Competition Bureau sought from Bureau mirrored those that were negotiated by the FTC a year earlier. And so I think that real action can happen through antitrust, but Canada lacks a lot of tools to actually do that effectively.
Subrata, let me ask the same question about the United States. How seriously do you think they're really investigating big tech's hold on their particular industry at the moment?
Well, I mean, I think apart from whatever cases are underway now in the U.S., the other thing that you'll notice is that Senator Klobuchar is now proposing sort of a draft new antitrust bill in the U.S. Congress. So that'll be something to be discussed over the next year or so. And also, you're now seeing the new Biden administration put its people into the leadership of the two agencies that administer American antitrust law, and some of those people have been the most strident critics of what I would say is sort of traditional antitrust policy approaches over the last 2 or 3 years. And so to me, I mean, apart from the cases, looking at what's going on in the US, watching the changes that will happen in sort of the senior leadership of the enforcement agencies and possibly a new law there will have some impact in sort of what we look at here in Canada. Now, we have our own economy, we have our own approaches. And so, we can't necessarily just follow what the U.S. does, but practically speaking, our economies are integrated. And in fact, the last time we changed the law, a big reason we changed the law was to try to at least harmonize our approach a little bit to what goes on in the U.S. So we've already got one foot kind of in that camp. And for sure, as the U.S. decide what it wants to do, there will be an impact for us here in Canada.
Well, okay. Let me, again, just for fun here, Murad, I'm going to push back a bit on this and say I'm not a cynical person. And I'm not going to name names here, but the person who led Barack Obama to 2 successful presidential campaign victories is now running one of the biggest, most important, richest tech companies in the United States. Can you imagine Barack Obama's vice president making Barack Obama's former campaign manager sleepless because he's going to go after him and try and break up his business? I mean, do we really think that's going to happen?
Well, it's interesting that you say this. During the presidential campaign, Senator Warren was calling for breakups of the largest tech companies, and we saw the House Commerce Committee, I think it was, in the U.S. was studying these. You were referring to sort of hauling these CEOs before them to testify. One of that set of sort of hauling in front of was this committee. They came out with this mammoth report. It's like hundreds of pages. It does not explicitly call for breakups, and we're talking about the House Democrats, who are generally, a little more progressive, radical, whatever the word you want to use is, than the Senate Democrats. So even the sort of the wing of the party that is engaged on these issues directly is not calling for breakups. That said, we're dealing with a global landscape of regulators. In fact, the EU has really been leading on a lot of the actual action in some of these areas. One example I'd point to, there's this big concern about whether Amazon uses the data of third-party vendors. So you're just a person who sells through Amazon. If they use that data to try and compete with them, so launch competing products, and then undercut those products so that Amazon takes more of that, more of those sales. The EU launched an investigation, moved to action, has been ahead of the US every step of the way. And then in turn, Canada has been like 2 years behind that. So, in August 2020, we launched, or the Competition Bureau here launched its own investigation. So I would say the US obviously is the big player. That's where a lot of these companies, most of these companies are based. They sort of have to answer to their home policymakers. But I wouldn't discount the ability of other jurisdictions to sort of lead on some of these files, because Amazon, Facebook can't own Instagram in the US and not in Europe, right? That's not how this would work.
Right. We've just got a couple of minutes left here, and Subrata, that's enough time for me to ask you to just take us to Australia, because that country made a lot of headlines recently for the way it responded to the power play that they and big tech were involved with. Set the scene for us and tell us how they got their way out of it.
So the Australian thing is interesting because the Australian competition agency called the ACCC sort of commenced an inquiry in 2018, again, using sort of a market study power that you have under Australian law that we don't have here in Canada, as Robin's pointed out. And so, the reasons for that inquiry are complex, have a lot to do with Australian sort of domestic politics. But at the end of the day, they conduct this study, and they arrive at a conclusion that there is market power on the part of certain the big tech companies, and then that also had an impact on news media. And what followed from that was the proposal of a code of conduct, which would essentially try to remedy what the ACCC thought was a power imbalance by requiring technology companies that used content to compensate media companies for that usage. Now, what's interesting is that in Australia, they were able to do that under their competition laws. And I'll get to that in a second. But in essence, as things began to escalate and as the recommendation got put into draft legislation, then is on its way to becoming law, there was a bit of a standoff between Facebook and Google and the Australian government about how they would respond to that. But ultimately, both cut deals to compensate, I think, initially pretty large media organizations as opposed to small ones. So I'm not sure how that's really supposed to work, but they did cut deals. And now there are other countries that are looking at doing that, but interestingly enough, under copyright and not necessarily competition law, which kind of does go back to the point of you can't assume that you can jam all your stuff in under competition law, because there are other tools that governments can use to address issues like that.
So Rupert Murdoch is happy. That's wonderful. Is that a template for us here in Canada?
Well, I think in order for us to adopt similar solutions in Canada, we need to be rethinking competition policy in Canada more broadly. Like we were just talking about, what's really unique about Australia is that there's this integration between antitrust, competition law, and consumer protection. The agency is integrated in that way. It serves both those functions. In Canada, we have less of that. And this comes back to, again, what we've been talking about today, about this older, more traditional way of understanding competition policy, which is that competition policy is about promoting economic efficiency, even if it comes at the cost of people's welfare. And the efficiencies defense is like the perfect example of that. And so if we want to be implementing these sorts of solutions under the umbrella of competition policy, Canadians need to be reflecting on the nature of our competition policy and thinking about whether we want to be integrating more of these consumer protection ideas into our laws and also the way that they're implemented. I think that a solution like is implemented in Australia is really interesting and innovative, and I'll be interested to see how it turns out. But as far as Canada's concerned, I feel like we're I think we'd have a lot of work to do in order to get to a point where we could implement something like that under the umbrella of competition policy, or, adjacent to it.
And Murad, literally in my last 20 seconds here, Google threatened to leave Australia. Did the threat pay off in the end?
Well, they got a loophole in the way that the thing works. That means that those deals that they cut with the large publishers could basically allow them to escape the forced arbitration is what they didn't want. So yeah, everybody got what they wanted. The Australian government got to declare a win, and Google and Facebook aren't necessarily subject to that strict law.
Good. Thanks, everybody, for this. We really appreciate your time. Robin Shaban, Murad Hemmadi, Subrata Bhattacharjee. It's great to have you all on TVO tonight. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.